I always believed my life would be simple. I never needed much, just a steady job, a loving wife, and a home where my family could feel safe. For the longest time, I thought I had it all. My wife, Mila, was the woman I had fallen for in my 20s, sharp-witted, beautiful in a way that never faded, and someone I trusted with everything. Our 14-year-old son, Joffrey, was the center of my world. He was growing up fast, taller by the day, his voice deepening, his attitude shifting as teenage years crept in. But no matter how much he changed, I still saw the same boy who used to run to me after school, eager to tell me about his day. We lived a modest life. I worked as a mechanic, fixing cars in a small town where everyone knew each other. The pay wasn't great, but it put food on the table, kept the lights on, and let us live without too many worries. Mila, on the other hand, had bigger ambitions. She had started an online home decor business a few years ago, and lately, it had been taking off. At first, I was proud of her. She worked hard, and I liked seeing her excited about something. But then, things started to shift. She spent more time on her phone, smiling at messages she never shared. Our conversations, once easy and full of laughter, had become short and routine. Did you take out the trash? Joffrey needs money for school. I have a meeting later. I barely recognized the way we spoke to each other anymore. Then there were the late nights. At first, she worked from home, staying up in her office, but then she started going out. She told me it was for business, meetings with clients, networking events. I didn't question it, I wanted to be a supportive husband. But then, one night, she came home with a faint scent of cologne on her clothes. Not mine. I told myself I was imagining things. Joffrey had been different too. Distant. He used to love helping me in the garage, handing me tools as I worked on cars. Lately, he barely came out of his room. He spent most of his time on his phone or computer, and even during dinner, he barely spoke. The only time we really connected was during our evening runs. It was something we'd done since he was 10, father and son, running through the quiet streets, racing each other to the last street lamp. But even that had changed. He was quieter. Distracted. One night, as we jogged side by side, I finally asked, "Is everything okay, kid?" Joffrey hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah. Just a lot on my mind." I wanted to push further, to ask if something was bothering him, but I held back. He was a teenager now, maybe this was just part of growing up. But something didn't feel right. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that things were normal. But late at night, when Mila rolled away from me in bed, when Joffrey sat at dinner with that distant look in his eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers. I told myself it was just stress. Just a rough patch. But in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered, "You're losing them." I refused to listen. Because if I did, I'd have to admit that my happy, simple life was starting to crack. And I wasn't sure I was ready to face what lay beneath. It started like any other evening. I was in the garage, working on an old pickup truck for a neighbor, my hands covered in grease, the smell of motor oil thick in the air. The sound of Joffrey's favorite video game echoed from inside the house. He had been playing for hours, occasionally shouting at his screen. Mila was upstairs in her office, probably answering emails or talking to one of her clients. It was an ordinary, uneventful night. Until it wasn't. At some point, the house fell silent. I didn't notice at first, too focused on tightening a stubborn bolt, but when I finished, wiped my hands on a rag, and walked inside, something felt off. The air was too still. "Joffrey?" I called. No answer. I glanced at the clock. 8:37 p.m. Mila came down the stairs, phone in hand. "Where's Joffrey?" she asked. I frowned. I thought he was in his room. She shook her head. "He's not there. I just checked." A cold sensation crept up my spine. He never left the house without telling us. I walked down the hallway and pushed his bedroom door open. The lights were on, his headset still resting on the desk, but he wasn't there. The game screen showed a paused match. His phone was gone. His shoes were still by the door. I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Mila, check outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She was already ahead of me, running to the backyard, calling his name. I grabbed my own phone, dialing his number. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail. Something was wrong. We searched the entire house, the yard, even the neighborhood. I ran down the street, calling his name, knocking on the neighbors' doors. No one had seen him. He wasn't at the park. He wasn't at any of his friends' houses. By 9:30 p.m., I called the police. By 10 p.m., patrol cars were circling the neighborhood, officers asking the same questions we didn't have answers to. No forced entry. No sign of a struggle. No witnesses. He was just gone. Mila was sobbing by the time we got back to the house, her hands shaking as she clutched her phone, waiting for any call, any message that might tell us where he was. But when the call finally came, we wished it hadn't. It was 11:12 p.m. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I saw the unknown number, I answered immediately. "Hello." My voice came out breathless, desperate. A voice on the other end, distorted, calm, controlled. "If you want to see your son alive, you'll get $2 million. My stomach twisted into a knot. Who is this? Where's Joffrey? The voice ignored my question. $2 million. No cops. No delays. You'll get instructions soon. Then the line went dead. I stood frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. Mila's eyes were wide with terror. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard. "They have him." Her hand flew to her mouth as a choked sob escaped her lips. And then the full weight of it hit me. Joffrey had been kidnapped. And if I didn't come up with $2 million, they would kill my son. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My mind kept replaying the words from the call. $2 million. No cops. No delays. My son's life depended on a number so large it felt impossible. Mila stood frozen in the doorway, eyes red, her face pale and hollow. "What do we do?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. I had never felt so helpless in my life. We weren't rich. We had savings, sure, but nowhere near that kind of money. Our house was mortgaged, our cars were paid off but not worth much. My job as a mechanic brought in enough to live comfortably, but we didn't have offshore accounts or hidden wealth to pull from. I dialed 911 again. "I need to report a ransom demand," I said, my voice shaking. But as soon as I mentioned the money, the officer on the other end hesitated. "Sir, we take this very seriously, but you need to understand, kidnappers almost always demand amounts that the victims can't afford. They may be willing to negotiate." Negotiate? My son was out there, alone, afraid, and they were telling me to haggle over his life. "I don't care what they're willing to do," I snapped. "I need him back." The officer sighed. "We have detectives who specialize in these cases. But if they find out you called us." I hung up before he could finish. Mila looked at me in horror. "Why did you do that?" "They said no cops," I muttered. She ran her hands through her hair, pacing the kitchen. "Maybe we should just go to them. Let them track the call." "They can." "They can what?" I interrupted. "They don't even know where to start. And if the kidnappers think we went to the cops, they might." My voice caught in my throat. I couldn't say it. I couldn't even think it. Mila collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I had no time to sit around feeling sorry for myself. I had to find the money. I started calling everyone I knew. First, my boss. He was a good guy, but the moment I said loan and urgent, his tone changed. Matthew, I wish I could, but 2 million. That's way beyond what I can do. Next, I called my closest friends, guys I had known for years, men who would have given me the shirt off their backs if I needed it. But none of them had that kind of money. I tried old family members, distant cousins, even a guy I hadn't spoken to in 10 years who had once won big in real estate. Nothing. Each call ended the same way. I'm so sorry, Matt. I wish I could help. Is there anything else I can do? The frustration clawed at my chest. What I needed was $2 million, not sympathy. As the night dragged on, I sat at the table, my head in my hands. I could hear Mila in the other room, talking in hushed whispers, but I was too exhausted to care. By the time the sun started creeping over the horizon, I had barely made a dent in what I needed. I had managed to scrape together promises of about $50,000 from various friends and family, barely a fraction of what was demanded. Mila walked back into the kitchen, her face tight, her arms crossed over her chest. Any luck? She asked. I shook my head. Not enough. She exhaled sharply and leaned against the counter. Maybe we need to think outside the box. I glanced up at her. What does that mean? She hesitated. I know someone who might be able to help. A private investigator. I frowned. A pie? How would that help? She bit her lip. He has connections. He might know how to deal with these kinds of people. I should have questioned it more. I should have asked why she knew a private investigator so well, why she seemed so certain he could help. But I was too desperate to think clearly. Fine, I said. Call him. Mila nodded quickly and stepped away, dialing a number she apparently knew by heart. I should have paid attention to that. But at that moment, all I could think about was my son, alone and terrified, and the ticking clock that was running out faster than I could keep up. By the time Mila got off the phone, she already had a meeting set up. His name is Alex Carter, she said. He's handled cases like this before. I barely registered the name. I was too exhausted, my mind too clouded with fear and desperation. If this guy could help us get Joffrey back, I didn't care who he was. Mila insisted on meeting him at a small diner outside of town. It's better to keep this discreet, she said. The fewer people who know we're looking for help, the better. That made sense to me. The kidnappers had been clear, no cops. If they found out we had involved anyone outside the family, they might do something terrible. I drove while Mila sat quietly beside me, checking her phone. Every time it buzzed, she tensed, her fingers gripping the device so tightly I thought she might crack the screen. I told myself it was stress. That she was just as scared as I was. The diner was mostly empty when we arrived. A few truckers sat at the counter, sipping coffee, and a waitress wiped down the tables with slow, tired movements. The place smelled like burnt bacon and cheap aftershave. And then I saw him. Alex Carter stood near a booth in the back, sipping a black coffee like he had all the time in the world. He looked exactly like the kind of guy you'd expect to see in a detective movie, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark button-up with the sleeves rolled up just enough to show off his forearms. His jaw was sharp, his blonde hair neatly styled, and his blue eyes were piercing, the kind that made you feel like he could see right through you. He gave Mila a small smile as we approached. I told myself I was imagining things when I saw her smile back. This must be Matthew, Alex said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, strong. I'm really sorry about what you're going through. Thanks for meeting us, I said. My throat felt dry. Mila says you have experience with kidnappings. Alex nodded, gesturing for us to sit. Not all cases end well, but I've helped in a few recoveries. Ransom situations are delicate, but they can be handled the right way if you play it smart. I leaned forward. I don't care about smart. I care about my son. How do I get him back? Alex studied me for a moment before answering. First, we gather intel. Kidnappers don't pick random targets. There's always a reason. I frowned. What do you mean? They just want money. Yes, Alex said. But why 2 million? That's an oddly specific number. Do they think you're rich? Are they connected to someone who knows you? His eyes flicked toward Mila, then back to me. Has your family had any problems with anyone? Business rivals? Old grudges? No, I said immediately. Mila hesitated. I turned to her. Mila? She quickly shook her head. No. Nothing like that. I let it go. I was too tired to pick apart her every reaction. Alex took out a notepad and clicked his pen. Okay. Let's go over the call again. I repeated everything I remembered, the distorted voice, the demand for money, the warning not to call the cops. Alex listened carefully, jotting down notes. And you have no way of getting 2 million, he asked. No, I said. I've made calls, but it's impossible. Alex exhaled. Then they'll have to settle for less. I tensed. What if they don't? They will, Alex said confidently. No matter what they say, they don't actually want to get rid of your son. He's their leverage. If they go through with their threats, they get nothing. Which means they'll be willing to negotiate. His calmness both reassured and unsettled me. How was he so sure? Mila reached across the table and touched my hand. We have to trust him. I nodded stiffly. What's the next step? Alex leaned back, tapping his pen against the table. I need to listen to the next call. When they call again, put them on speaker. I'll analyze their voice, their phrasing, try to figure out what kind of people we're dealing with. I exhaled shakily. And then? Then we play their game, Alex said. But on our terms. His confidence was exactly what I needed. For the first time since Joffrey had gone missing, I felt a flicker of hope. I didn't know yet that it was all a lie. The next few days blurred together. Every waking second was consumed by a single thought, get Joffrey back. I barely slept, barely ate. My phone was always in my hand, waiting for another call, another demand, anything that could bring me closer to my son. Alex assured me he was making progress. He spent hours going over the ransom call, analyzing the distortions in the voice, breaking down the language they used. He claimed he had contacts who might be able to trace the source, but so far, there was nothing concrete. I was desperate for action. I hated sitting around, waiting. Mila, on the other hand, seemed to trust Alex completely. She followed his lead without question, nodding along to every word he said, leaning in when he spoke, hanging on his every detail. I noticed, but I told myself it didn't matter. She was just as scared as I was. Alex started coming over more often. He made himself comfortable in my home, sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee from our mugs, going over his notes while Mila hovered nearby. Did you sleep at all? Mila asked me one morning, concern in her voice. I shook my head. Not really. You need to rest, she urged. You look exhausted. I can't rest, I snapped. Not while he's out there. She flinched but didn't argue. I felt bad, but I couldn't afford to stop. The moment I sat down, my mind started spinning. Where was Joffrey? Was he scared? Was he hurt? Did he think we weren't coming for him? Alex placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. We'll get him back, Matt. I promise. I nodded, but I didn't trust promises. That afternoon, Mila and Alex went into the other room to take a private call. They said it was one of Alex's contacts, someone who might have leads. I started to follow them, but Alex turned and held up a hand. "Better if we keep this between us for now," he said. I hesitated. "Why?" "Because if they think we have too many people involved, they'll back off," Mila added quickly. "We can't risk that." I wanted to argue, but I was too tired. My thoughts were jumbled, my body heavy. I let them go, rubbing my temples as I tried to push through my exhaustion. The voices in the other room were low, muffled. I heard Alex talking, then Mila's voice, softer, almost a whisper. My stomach twisted. No. I was imagining things. I forced myself to think about Joffrey, about the money. That was what mattered. Over the next few days, I noticed more. The way Mila lingered near Alex, the way they locked eyes when they spoke. The way she laughed at something he said, laughed. How the hell could she laugh when our son was missing? Once, I walked into the room and found them standing too close. Mila's hand was resting lightly on Alex's arm. The second she saw me, she pulled away. Alex barely reacted. He just gave me that same confident, reassuring look. And I let it go. Because I had no choice. I told myself it was stress. That I was reading too much into things. That Mila was just leaning on Alex because she needed support. She needed support. But why did it feel like I was the only one drowning? I had never known exhaustion like this. Days of running on nothing but fear and desperation had hollowed me out. Every breath felt like a weight on my chest, every second without Joffrey a fresh stab of panic. But somehow, after what felt like an eternity, I did it. It took everything, every favor I could call in, every debt I could promise to repay. I sold my truck, liquidated what little savings we had, and borrowed from anyone willing to lend. Friends, co-workers, distant family members I hadn't spoken to in years, I begged them all. Piece by piece, the money came together. Not all of it. Not the full $2 million. But close enough. $1.6 million. Alex had been the one to convince me to try negotiating. "They don't want your son dead," he said. "They want the money. If we offer them this much, they'll take it." We had no choice but to hope he was right. The second ransom call came late that night. I put them on speaker, just as Alex had instructed. "I have the money," I said, my voice raw. A pause. Then the distorted voice again. "Is it all of it?" $1.6 million, Alex cut in smoothly. "It's the best we could do on short notice. You won't get a cent more." Silence. My heart pounded in my ears. Then, finally, dropped the money off at the old shipping yard on Wexler Avenue. Midnight. "Come alone." The line went dead. I exhaled shakily. This was it. I barely noticed Mila gripping my arm. "What if they don't let him go?" she whispered. "They will," Alex assured her. "They have no reason to keep him once they have the money." I didn't respond. I just grabbed the duffel bags of cash and headed for the door. Alex stopped me. "Let me go with you." "No," I said. "They said alone." Alex hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful." The drive to Wexler Avenue was the longest of my life. My hands were shaking on the wheel. The streets were empty, abandoned warehouses casting long shadows under flickering streetlights. I pulled into the shipping yard. A single car was parked across from me, its headlights off. My stomach twisted. I stepped out, gripping the duffel bags so tightly my fingers ached. A figure emerged from the other car, dressed in all black, face obscured by a hood and mask. "Put the money on the ground," the distorted voice said. I swallowed hard. "Where's my son?" The figure tilted their head. Then, a back door opened, and Joffrey. My knees nearly buckled. He was standing there, pale and shaking, his clothes rumpled, dark circles under his eyes. But he was alive. "Joffrey," I gasped. The masked figure stepped between us. "Put the money down." Then he walks. I hesitated for only a second before dropping the duffel bags. The figure bent down, unzipping one bag to check inside. Then they stepped back and gestured toward Joffrey. "Go." Joffrey stumbled toward me. I grabbed him, pulling him into my arms so tightly he let out a small gasp. "It's okay," I whispered. "I've got you." But as I held him, I realized, he wasn't okay. He was trembling violently, his breathing ragged. His hands were like ice. I pulled back to look at him. "Did they hurt you?" He shook his head quickly. "No. They just kept me in a room. No windows. No light." His voice cracked. "I thought you weren't coming." A fresh wave of guilt crashed over me. "Never," I swore. "I would never stop looking for you." The masked figure spoke again. "Leave. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I guided Joffrey back to the car, shielding him with my body as I opened the passenger door. He collapsed into the seat, his body limp with exhaustion. I threw one last look at the masked figure before slamming the door and driving away. Joffrey was home. But as I glanced at him, slumped against the window, barely keeping his eyes open, I knew. Whatever had happened to him in those days he was gone, it had changed him. Joffrey had been home for 3 days, but it still didn't feel real. I kept checking on him, afraid that if I looked away for too long, he'd vanish again. He barely spoke, barely ate. He jumped at sudden noises, flinched when the doorbell rang. At night, I heard him shifting in bed, never really sleeping. I was exhausted, but I didn't care. I stayed awake with him, sitting outside his room, listening for any sound that might mean he needed me. Mila, on the other hand, seemed eager to move on. "We need to start acting normal," she said that morning. "Joffrey needs to see that life goes on." I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. I just nodded and went about my day, trying to convince myself that we were on the path to healing. I was wrong. That night, I woke up in a daze, disoriented by the silence. I checked the clock, 2:17 a.m. Joffrey's door was slightly open, and I peeked inside. He was curled up under his blanket, finally asleep. A relief. But something felt off. The house was too quiet. Mila wasn't in bed. I frowned and stood up, rubbing my eyes as I walked down the hallway. Maybe she was in the kitchen, getting water. But then I heard something. A muffled noise, a low sound, voices. I followed the noise toward the garage. The door was slightly ajar. And then I heard her. Mila's voice. A sound I knew well. But not like this. Not breathless. Not moaning. My stomach twisted as I reached for the door. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. My fingers were ice cold. I pushed the door open. And there they were. Mila. Alex. Together. She was against the hood of my car, her shirt pushed up, Alex's hands all over her. His lips on her neck. Her fingers digging into his back. For a moment, my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. Then Mila's eyes flicked up, and met mine. Everything froze. I saw the exact moment the horror registered on her face. Matt. Alex turned, blinking, his hands still gripping her body. I didn't think. I moved. My fist connected with his jaw so hard he stumbled backward into the garage shelf, knocking over tools and cans of motor oil. Mila screamed. Matt, stop. Alex tried to get up, but I was already on him, grabbing his shirt, dragging him toward the door. He swung at me, but I didn't feel it. My body was nothing but rage. I threw him against the wall. Get out. My voice didn't even sound like mine. He wiped the blood from his mouth, his blue eyes flashing with something, shock. Arrogance. He wasn't afraid of me. That made it worse. I shoved him toward the door again. I said, "Get out." He stumbled into the hallway, his shirt half open, his hands shaking as he grabbed his jacket from the chair. Mila ran after him. "Alex, wait." I grabbed her wrist, my fingers digging into her skin. She gasped, her eyes wide. "Matt, let go." I yanked her back inside and slammed the door in Alex's face. I barely heard him curse as he stomped away. I barely cared. I turned to her. My wife. The woman I had spent the last 16 years with. The mother of my son. The woman I had trusted. She stood there, breathing hard, her shirt still unbuttoned. And then, she had the audacity to cry. "Matt," she whispered. I can explain." "Explain? Explain what?" "Explain why she was with him. Explain why, while I was breaking myself trying to save our son, she was sneaking around behind my back. Explain how Alex, the man I let into my home, the man I trusted to help us, had been sleeping with my wife the entire time." A laugh tore out of me. It was ugly. Bitter. "Explain." I repeated, stepping closer. "All right. Go ahead. Tell me." Tears rolled down her face. I didn't mean for this to happen. Didn't mean for what to happen. I snapped. Didn't mean to get caught. She flinched. "Matt, please." I shook my head, my whole body trembling. "How long?" She swallowed. "Matt. How long?" She hesitated. That tiny moment of hesitation told me everything. My stomach sank. It wasn't just during the kidnapping, was it? My voice was hollow. "You were with him before." She didn't answer. I stepped back, shaking my head. My whole world felt like it was collapsing. Joffrey. I had been so focused on saving my son, so consumed by the fear of losing him, that I hadn't even noticed what was happening right in front of me. I clenched my fists, my breathing uneven. "I want you out of my house." Mila's face crumpled. "Matt, please. Out." She sobbed. "Where am I supposed to go?" I laughed again, sharp and cruel. "I don't give a damn." Her lips trembled. "Matt, don't do this." "Joffrey." I took a step forward, my voice like ice. "You don't get to say his name." She broke. I saw it in her face. And I didn't care. I pointed at the door. "Pack your things. I don't want to see you here in the morning." She opened her mouth, maybe to beg, maybe to fight, but she saw the look in my eyes. And she knew. There was nothing left to save. She turned and ran up the stairs. I stood there, shaking, feeling like I was about to explode. And then I heard a sound behind me. A sharp inhale. I turned. Joffrey. He stood in the hallway, barefoot, wearing an oversized hoodie, his face pale. I don't know how much he had seen. But I saw the look in his eyes. And I knew. He had already lost his innocence once when he was taken. And now, in the space of a single night. He had lost his stepmother, too. The house was silent after Mila left. Joffrey barely spoke. He spent most of his time locked in his room, headphones on, eyes empty. I didn't push him. I didn't know how to reach him, not after everything he'd been through. I spent my nights awake, staring at the ceiling, running through every detail of the last few weeks. The ransom call. The impossible sum they demanded. Mila's strange behavior. Alex. And then, a thought crept in. A thought so dark, so insane, that I nearly dismissed it. What if it had all been a setup? At first, it seemed impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more things started to click. $2 million. It was a ridiculous number. No one in their right mind would believe we had that kind of money. But Mila knew we didn't have it. She knew how much we had in savings, how much I made. So why demand an amount we couldn't possibly pay? Because they didn't actually need it. They just needed something. Something to pressure me. To break me down. To make me desperate enough that I'd let Mila take control. Let her bring in Alex. And Alex, he was never investigating anything, was he? He was just keeping me busy. Making sure I didn't ask too many questions. Keeping my mind on the money, while he was in my house. With my wife. I gripped the edge of the table, my breath coming in sharp bursts. Had Mila done this? Had she actually used our son, just to steal from me? No. It was too much. Even for her. Wasn't it? I had to know the truth. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the police station. The station was nearly empty when I arrived. A bored-looking officer sat at the front desk, scrolling through his phone. "I need to speak to a detective," I said. My voice was raw. The officer barely glanced at me. "What's this about?" "My son's kidnapping," I said through clenched teeth. That got his attention. He straightened, narrowing his eyes. "I thought that case was closed. You paid the ransom, kid came home. No leads." "No leads?" I repeated, anger flaring in my chest. "That's it? That's all you're going to do?" The officer sighed and rubbed his temple. "Look, I get it. You went through hell. But these kinds of cases, if the kidnappers don't leave a trail, there's not much we can do." I leaned in. "What if I told you I think the whole thing was staged?" The officer's expression didn't change. "By who?" "My wife," I said, the words tasting like poison. He studied me for a long moment. "That's a serious accusation." "I know," I snapped. "That's why I'm here. I want an investigation." He sighed, scribbling something on a notepad. "I'll let the detectives know." But something in his tone was off. He wasn't taking me seriously. He wasn't going to do a damn thing. I left the station more furious than when I arrived. The next day, I got a call from a friend of mine, Dan, a guy I had known since high school. He worked in security, had connections with local law enforcement. "You went to the cops?" he asked the second I answered. "Yeah." "Why?" Dan was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Walk away, Matt." I stiffened. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm saying, that case of yours. It's never getting solved." Coldness spread through my chest. "Why not?" Dan hesitated. "Word is, someone paid to make sure it doesn't get solved." My blood turned to ice. "Who?" "Don't know. But the way I heard it, a lot of money changed hands." My grip tightened on the phone. "How much?" I asked. Dan exhaled. $2 million. The world seemed to tilt. $2 million. The exact amount the kidnappers had demanded. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Mila had gotten exactly what she wanted. The ransom was paid. The cops weren't investigating. And now she was gone. She had played me. Used me. Used my son. And now she was free, with the money, with Alex. I felt something inside me snap. No. This wasn't over. Justice was dead. I had spent my whole life believing in it. Believing that when people did wrong, they paid for it. That when someone was hurt, someone, anyone, would fight for them. But the world didn't work that way. Mila had proven that. She had orchestrated the worst nightmare of my life. She had let our son suffer in a dark, windowless room, terrified and alone, just so she could get rich and run off with her goddamn lover. And the police? They didn't care. Someone had paid them off. $2 million had disappeared into their pockets, and that was the end of it. Case closed. Joffrey's trauma, my suffering, didn't matter. Mila was free. Smiling. Happy. Spending my money with that bastard. It wasn't enough that she betrayed me. She had to win. No. Not this time. I found them easily. Mila hadn't gone far. She had rented a sleek little house in a gated community on the outskirts of town. Brand new furniture. New clothes. A whole new life. It was disgusting how quickly she had moved on. Alex's car was parked right outside the house, a black BMW, spotless, polished. Expensive. Paid for with my pain. It made me sick. I parked down the street and waited. Watching. I had never done anything like this before, never even thought about it. But now, the plan came to me easily. Like it had been sitting in the back of my mind all along, waiting for this moment. That night, when I was sure they were asleep, I moved. Gloves on. Hood up. Heart steady. The street was dark, deserted. Security cameras. Useless. They only recorded entrances to the houses, not the parked cars. I slid under the BMW, my breath slow and controlled. I found the brake lines in seconds. Thin rubber tubing. Delicate. Fragile. One clean slice. Then another. Fluid dripped onto the pavement, pooling beneath the car. That was it. I slid back out, glanced up at the house. No lights. No movement. I walked back to my truck, my hands steady, my mind blank. Tomorrow, it would happen. Tomorrow, Mila and Alex would wake up in their perfect little world. They'd drink their coffee, kiss, laugh, and get into that car, completely unaware. Tomorrow, they would speed down the highway, heading toward whatever hellhole they were running off to next. And tomorrow, when Alex tried to brake, nothing would happen. The crash made the morning news. High-speed collision. 90 miles per hour. Lost control. They had hit a tree just off the highway. The car was totaled. But they were alive. Barely. Mila had been thrown through the windshield. Broken ribs. Broken arm. Deep gashes all over her face. Alex? Worse. His legs were shattered. One lung collapsed. Doctors weren't sure if he'd ever walk again. I sat in my truck, staring at the news article on my phone. No one suspected a thing. Reckless driving, the report said. Excessive speed. No mention of sabotage. No one thought to check. The perfect accident. I exhaled, slow and even. They weren't dead. But they would never be the same. Just like me. Just like Joffrey. I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat and started the engine. There was one last thing I had to do. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale air. The kind of place where people either got better or wasted away. I walked through the halls slowly, calmly. Nurses passed by, barely giving me a second glance. No one questioned why I was here. I already knew which room she was in. Mila Carter. Not Mila Thompson. Not anymore. She had taken his name. I stopped in front of the door. Took a breath. Then I stepped inside. She looked awful. Her face was bruised, swollen, stitched up in places where glass had torn through her skin. Her left arm was wrapped in a thick cast, resting awkwardly against her stomach. Tubes ran from her arm to and fore bag. Machines beeped softly beside her. She looked up at me. Her lips parted slightly. Matt. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I pulled up a chair, sat down slowly, and met her eyes. She looked scared. Good. She should be. I leaned in slightly, just enough that she could hear me clearly. This is for my son, I said, my voice low, even. Her eyes filled with tears. Matt, please. I stood up. Turned around. And walked out. I didn't look back. She could live with this. With the pain. The scars. The wreckage of everything she tried to build with him. Because unlike Joffrey and me, she would never heal.